What if I told you the worst year to be alive wasn't during the Black Death or World War II, but over 1,500 years ago? In 536 AD, a mysterious fog plunged the world into darkness, triggering a chain reaction of famine, plague, and societal collapse. Tonight, we're unravelling the science and suffering behind history's most forgotten catastrophe. Picture this. You wake up, rub your eyes, and notice something's wrong. The sun should be up by now, but the world outside looks like a dim, smoky dusk. You wait. Hours pass, the light never changes. That was every morning in 536 AD. A volcano erupted, likely in Iceland, and pumped enough sulphur into the atmosphere to blot out the sun across the northern hemisphere. Not just for a day or week, but for 18 months straight. The sky didn't darken completely, but the sun shone weakly, like a candle behind the thick parchment. Contemporary accounts describe it as a dry fog, something unlike anything seen before. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, comparing it to an endless solar eclipse. Temperatures plummeted. Summer frosts killed crops from Gaul to China. In Ireland, records mention a failure of bread for 3 straight years. Tree rings from that period show nearly no growth, marking some of the coldest decades in the last 2,000 years. Ice cores from Greenland contained sulfur spikes more than twice as high as anything from the past millennia. Evidence of a volcanic blast far worse than Krakatoa. The effects were immediate. Without sunlight, photosynthesis ground to a halt. Grains withered, fruit didn't ripen, livestock starved. People ate whatever they could find: tree bark, roots, even dirt mixed with flour. In some places, the desperate resorted to cannibalism. Chinese texts report frost in August and widespread famine. The Irish annals describe a mortality of people so severe that survivors stopped burying the dead properly. And that was just the first year. The prolonged darkness set off a chain reaction. Without crops, trade networks collapsed. Without trade, cities emptied. Without order, violence spread. It wasn't just hunger. It was the unravelling of entire societies. The fog eventually lifted, but the damage was already done. The climate didn't recover for decades. Temperatures remained low, harvests stayed meagre, and diseases found easy prey in weakened populations. By the time the sun returned in full, the world was already sliding into crisis. But the darkness was just the beginning. Starvation doesn't just empty stomachs, it unravels societies. By 536 AD, food shortages weren't just local emergencies anymore. They became global catastrophes. The volcanic winter froze crops across continents, and suddenly no region could rely on imports to fill the gap. Everyone was starving at the same time. In Constantinople, grain shipments stopped arriving from Egypt. In Scandinavia, cattle died from lack of forage. Chinese records describe rice paddies frozen solid in midsummer. No one had contingency plans for years without harvests. People ate weeds first, then tree bark, then the carcasses of starved livestock. Some boiled old bones to make thin broth. By the second year, reports mention people consuming clay mixed with flour, a desperate trick that swelled their stomachs while providing no nutrition. Evidence from mass graves across Europe shows the physical toll. Skeletons from this period display signature signs of malnutrition: porous bones, stunted growth in children, teeth with deep horizontal grooves marking periods of acute starvation. In some British graves, archaeologists found remains with knife marks matching survival cannibalism. A Frankish chronicle mentions parents selling children for food, then disappearing themselves. Authorities tried to respond, but their solutions often made things worse. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian ordered price controls on grain, which just encouraged hoarding. Some regional governors confiscated private food stores for fair distribution that never reached the needy. In Rome, the church opened its granaries but couldn't prevent riots that left storerooms looted and officials dead. The worst-hit regions collapsed entirely. Abandoned villages appear suddenly in the archaeological record, tools left mid-task, pots still on hearths. Burial sites show entire families interred together, suggesting no survivors remained to bury them properly. Some communities may have turned to human sacrifice. Icelandic sagas later referenced hunger times, when kings ordered offerings to the gods. Trade routes that had survived the fall of Rome now vanished completely. Without surplus grain to transport, merchant ships rotted at anchor. Road networks grew over with weeds, as no one travelled to markets that didn't exist. Gold coins disappeared from circulation as people bartered for bags of millet instead. The psychological effects transformed societies. Some starving people reportedly stopped recognising family members. Other accounts describe masses wandering between towns, begging incoherently before collapsing. With no understanding of atmospheric science, many interpreted the endless twilight and failed crops as divine punishment. Flagellant movements arose in multiple regions as people sought to atone for whatever sins had brought this disaster. By late 537, entire governmental structures had failed. In Gaul, tax collection ceased because no one had anything left to pay. Local officials abandoned their posts to search for food. The Roman Senate, already a ceremonial body by this time, stopped meeting altogether. Even in Constantinople, normally insulated by its vast wealth, guards deserted palace walls to hunt for scraps in the countryside. The remarkable thing about famine is how quickly it resets priorities. Courts stopped hearing property disputes. What mattered when no one could farm the land? Churches still held masses, but attendance dwindled as parishioners either died or spent every waking hour foraging. Scholarship nearly disappeared. Why transcribe manuscripts when you could trade parchment for a loaf of mouldy bread? Yet through all this suffering, one cruel twist remained. Many who survived the starvation would soon face an even deadlier threat, because weakened bodies offered no resistance when the plague ships arrived in 541. The few remaining granaries became perfect breeding grounds for another kind of horror. And then the plague arrived. Just when survival seemed impossible, disease finished the job. The sun had returned by 541 AD, but the damage was already done. Starved bodies became perfect targets for the plague that arrived that year. This wasn't its first appearance. The Justinian plague had surfaced years earlier, but now it found ideal conditions. Malnourished immune systems crumbled before the infection. The plague spread differently in this new, broken world. Normally it might have burned through cities and slowed when reaching rural areas. Now, with displaced populations crowding into whatever town still had food, the disease found everywhere flammable. Contemporary descriptions mention buboes swelling to the size of apples, blackened skin, fever so high it cooked brains. People collapsed in market squares, their last act reaching for food they'd never eat. Genetic studies show how perfectly adapted the plague was for this moment. Strains from this period had mutations allowing infection through both fleas and respiratory droplets, an evolutionary nightmare scenario. A starving refugee could catch it from another person's cough, then bring it home to their family through flea-infested rags. Rats, normally the disease's main carriers, weren't even necessary now. Cities became death traps. Constantinople, already weakened by years of food shortages, lost perhaps 40% of its population in months. Officials stopped collecting bodies, leaving piles in streets and courtyards. The few functioning courts handled only inheritance cases. So many people died that property disputes became the main legal activity. In Rome, the plague killed so quickly that some victims were buried with their last meal half-eaten beside them. Rural areas fared no better. Villages already reduced by hunger disappeared entirely when plague arrived. Some settlements show evidence of hasty mass graves, dozens of bodies tossed in together with no markers. Archaeologists find these pits by the abnormally high lead content in the soil. So many people were buried with their cheap lead crosses that it poisoned the earth. The psychological effects compounded the horror. After years of unexplained darkness and starvation, many saw the plague as final divine judgment. In Gaul, mobs lynched strangers accused of poisoning wells. Eastern bishops wrote of people abandoning sick family members to die alone. A few accounts mention plague parties, groups who decided to feast and drink through their last days, infecting each other faster in the process. Economic systems that had survived the famine now collapsed completely. Skilled labourers died in droves, leaving no one to repair crumbling infrastructure. Tax collectors stopped visiting entire regions. What was the point when most taxpayers were dead? Copper coins disappeared from use as people reverted to bartering scraps of food and cloth. The death toll remains debated. but some regions clearly lost over half their population. Recent studies comparing pre-plague and post-plague settlement patterns suggest certain areas of Europe may have been nearly emptied. Britain appears especially hard hit, with archaeological evidence showing complete abandonment of some farming regions. Merchant networks that had survived Rome's fall finally dissolved. No one sailed the Mediterranean to trade goods that no longer existed. The few surviving ships carried only plague and desperate refugees. Knowledge of distant regions faded as travel ceased. It would take centuries for some trade routes to reopen. Oddly enough, the plague's timing may have prevented even greater catastrophe. By culling the already diminished population, it reduced pressure on remaining food supplies. Those who survived the initial waves found slightly better harvests in subsequent years. There were simply fewer mouths to feed. Some historians argue this brutal equilibrium allowed eventual recovery. The plague faded by 549, but not before reshaping every society it touched. Governments that had limped through the famine now lacked the manpower to function. Churches lost priests and parishioners in equal measure. Legal systems adapted. Byzantine courts began accepting testimony from younger witnesses since so few adults remained alive. Survivors faced a changed world. Farms lay empty not from lack of food, but lack of workers. Crafts like masonry and metalwork nearly disappeared as masters died without apprentices. Some villages resorted to drawing lots for essential jobs. One lucky man might become both blacksmith and coffin maker. But why does this disaster remain so forgotten? When systems fail, civilization crumbles from within. By the late 530s, the foundations of society were already cracking. Then the earthquake came. Trade routes that had connected empires for centuries vanished almost overnight. Roads grew over with weeds after just a few seasons without maintenance. Ports that once hosted ships from 3 continents stood empty, their docks rotting into the sea. The grand networks of exchange and communication simply stopped functioning. Cities emptied at a startling rate. Rome, which still clung to remnants of its former glory, saw entire districts abandoned. Archaeological digs show layers of debris piling up in streets. No one remained to clear them. In smaller towns across Europe, the pattern repeats. Homes left with cooking pots still on the hearth. Tools dropped mid-task, as if people walked away suddenly. Some settlements show signs of deliberate burning, perhaps to prevent plague spread, or erase memories of suffering. Governments that had weathered earlier crises now collapsed entirely. Tax collectors stopped travelling. There was nothing left to tax. Military garrisons deserted their posts to search for food. The Byzantine Empire, strongest of the era, saw its provincial administration shrink to a skeleton crew. Local officials took matters into their own hands, imposing brutal emergency measures that often exacerbated the chaos. One surviving edict from Gaul orders the execution of anyone caught hoarding grain, but exempts the wealthy landowners who issued it. Lawlessness became the new normal. Without functioning courts or city watches, violence spread unchecked. Graves from this period show unusually high rates of traumatic injuries, not from battle, but from blunt force trauma suggesting civilian assaults. Household treasures get buried in odd places, as if owners feared robbery but never returned to retrieve them. In some British settlements, archaeologists find hidden caches of jewellery wrapped in cloth, still waiting underground after 15 centuries. The abandonment wasn't uniform. Some regions adapted better than others. The Arabian Peninsula, somewhat insulated by distance, maintained trade along the Red Sea. Parts of Scandinavia turned to fishing when crops failed. But these were exceptions. Most of Europe entered what we'd later call a Dark Age, though that term fails to capture the visceral reality. It wasn't just a decline in art or scholarship, it was the return of survival as a full-time occupation. Education suffered immediate losses. Fewer people could read or write as schools disappeared. Surviving texts from this period show declining quality in materials. Parchment grows thinner, ink fades faster. The Venerable Bede later wrote about entire monasteries where only one monk remained literate enough to copy texts. Knowledge that wasn't practical for immediate survival often vanished completely. Roman engineering techniques disappeared from use in many regions, not to be rediscovered for centuries. Archaeological evidence paints a stark picture of the retreat. Pollen studies show forests reclaiming farmland across Europe. Iron production dropped sharply. No one had surplus resources for smelting. Pottery becomes cruder, as specialised kilns shut down and potters worked with whatever clay they could scavenge. Even burial practices simplified, with fewer grave goods and more mass interments. Some societies attempted reorganisation. In parts of Gaul, warlords carved out small territories where they enforced brutal order. The Byzantine Empire consolidated power around a few defensible cities. Britain fractured into competing petty kingdoms, their borders constantly shifting. But these were stopgap measures, not recoveries. The systems of law and administration lacked the complexity they'd had before the catastrophe. Economic activity never returned to pre-disaster levels within most people's lifetimes. Coin hoards from this period show currencies going out of circulation. People preferred barter instead. Market towns that once hosted traders from distant regions now served only their immediate vicinity. Workshops that produced luxury goods disappeared entirely in many areas. The grand villas of wealthy landowners fell into ruin, their mosaic floors cracked by frost heave and neglect. The psychological impact reshaped cultures for generations. Oral traditions from this era speak of a time when the world grew old, or the years without summers. Some Scandinavian sagas reference a great serpent swallowing the sun, likely folk memories of the volcanic haze. Christian and pagan traditions alike incorporated imagery of divine punishment and atonement that persists even now. Religion itself changed under the strain. Churches that once competed for theological purity now focused on basic survival. Miracle cures and relics gained new prominence as desperate populations sought supernatural salvation. Some clergy abandoned their posts, while others gained unprecedented local power as the last authority figures left standing. The balance between secular and religious governance shifted permanently in many regions. Technology regressed in noticeable ways. Without trade to distribute materials or techniques, regions reverted to more primitive methods. Roofs that once used quality Roman tile now featured thatch. Iron tools became smaller and less refined as metal supplies dwindled. Even clothing simplified. Archaeological finds show a decline in complex weaving patterns and dyes. The population collapse created eerie silences. Villages that had stood for generations lay empty, their fields reverting to wilderness. Roads once packed with travellers saw perhaps one traveller a week. Market squares where hundreds once gathered might host just a few haggard merchants. The sounds of industry, blacksmiths' hammers, mill wheels turning, faded from many regions entirely. Yet amid the collapse, seeds of recovery eventually sprouted. By the mid-600s, some areas show signs of stabilisation, more consistent crop yields, slight increases in trade. But the world that emerged looked very different from what came before. Power structures were more localised, economies simpler, and knowledge far more fragmented. The volcanic winter and its aftermath didn't just cause suffering, it reshaped history's trajectory. Still, the cause of it all remained a mystery for centuries. No one in the 500s could have known about Icelandic volcanoes or atmospheric science. They only knew the sun dimmed, their children starved, and the world they understood fell apart. The truth would stay hidden in ice and tree rings, waiting for modern tools to uncover it. Science finally uncovered the trigger for the disaster, but it took 1,500 years. In the 20th century, researchers found the truth hidden in unlikely places: ancient ice and tree rings. These natural archives revealed clues no written record could provide. The smoking gun lay in Greenland's ice cores. When scientists drilled deep into glaciers, they found layers containing unusual sulfur spikes dated to 536 AD. The concentration was staggering, roughly triple the levels from known volcanic events like Tambora's 1815 eruption. Sulfur dioxide turns into sulfuric acid in the atmosphere, forming reflective particles that linger for years. The ice didn't just show one spike either, but multiple over a decade, suggesting several eruptions compounded the damage. Tree rings added more evidence. Samples from European oaks and North American bristlecone pines almost stopped growing around 536. The rings become stunted for nearly 15 years, a botanical testimony to cold summers and weak sunlight. Some trees show frost damage in what should have been their growing season. Unlike human chroniclers, trees don't exaggerate. Their rings record the climate's brutality in perfect, unemotional detail. Pinpointing the culprit required more detective work. Chemical signatures in the ice pointed toward Iceland. The sulfur isotopes matched those from Icelandic fissures rather than tropical volcanoes. Aerial surveys eventually spotted telltale craters under Vatnajökull Glacier, the remnants of a volcanic system capable of such devastation. When it erupted, it didn't just spew lava. It fired ash and gases straight into the stratosphere where winds could spread them globally. The eruption's scale defies imagination. Estimates suggest it ejected over 100 cubic kilometres of material, enough to bury Manhattan under a mile of ash. Temperatures dropped more dramatically than during the Little Ice Age. Summer averages in Europe fell by 2.5 degrees Celsius, with some regions seeing spikes of summer frost. Such changes might sound minor until you realise crops fail with just a 1 degree Celsius drop. Survivors had no framework to understand this disaster. Lacking atmospheric science, they interpreted events through superstition. Byzantine scholars blamed a sign from God. Chinese astronomers recorded yellow dust falling from the sky. Irish monks wrote of a failure of bread without linking it to the dim sun. For centuries, the fog remained an unexplained horror, until glaciologists found its fingerprint in ice. Modern volcanologists classify this as a VEI-7 event, one of only 3 in the last 2,000 years. The energy release dwarfed famous eruptions like Mount St. Helens. It wasn't just the initial blast that caused problems, but the prolonged aftermath. Sulfate aerosols lingered in the atmosphere for years, creating a planetary sunshield. Rainfall patterns shifted unpredictably. Some regions flooded while others starved for water. The climate didn't stabilise until the 500s. Could it happen again? Absolutely. Iceland's volcanic systems remain active. Katla, another massive Icelandic volcano, erupts roughly every 50 years. Its next major event is overdue. Indonesia's Lake Toba, site of a VEI-8 super eruption 75,000 years ago, still shows geothermal activity. The difference now lies in detection, not risk. Satellites would spot signs weeks in advance, and global supply chains could theoretically buffer food shortages, assuming politics don't interfere. Preparation remains questionable. When Iceland's Eyjafjallajökull erupted in 2010, its relatively small ash cloud grounded European air travel for weeks. Governments had no playbook for the economic ripple effects. A larger eruption would test emergency systems beyond their limits. Stockpiles of food and medicine assume short disruptions, not years of scarcity. Urban populations dependent on just-in-time deliveries would face immediate crises. The 536 eruption offers sobering lessons about fragility. Complex societies depend on stable climates more than we admit. Our infrastructures assume certain temperature ranges, rainfall patterns, and growing seasons. Ancient Rome had resilience problems, but at least its citizens knew how to store grain. Modern cities keep perhaps 3 days' worth of food in circulation at any moment. The volcanoes haven't changed, only our illusions of control have. Some historians argue we're overdue for another VEI-7 event. They occur roughly once every 600 to 800 years, and the last one, Tambora 1815, was technically smaller than 536's catastrophe. Ice cores show similar eruptions around 540 AD, and again in the 1250s, meaning they can cluster uncomfortably close together. The question isn't if another will happen, but when. Climate change adds new complications. Some models suggest warming oceans could increase underwater volcanic activity. Others warn that shifting atmospheric circulation might spread ash plumes differently than in the past. One certainty remains. Volcanoes don't care about human timelines. Their eruptions unfold on geological schedules that laugh at our 5-year plans. Yet for all we've learned, mysteries remain. The ice cores contain traces of at least 2 other major eruptions in the 540s. Was this a cluster of disasters? Did cometary impacts contribute to the atmospheric haze? Some Antarctic ice samples show elevated platinum around this period, hinting at possible extraterrestrial factors. Science keeps refining the picture, but the past guards its secrets stubbornly. The biggest unanswered question isn't geological but historical. How did this event redirect civilization's trajectory? Did it accelerate the fall of Rome? spread pandemics, reshape migration patterns. The climate data is clear, but human responses remain debated. Archaeology provides glimpses: abandoned villages, changed burial practices, altered trade routes, yet much stays open for interpretation. One fact emerges with crystalline clarity from all the ice and tree rings and soil layers. 536 AD wasn't just a bad year, it was a hinge moment that forced humanity through a narrowing passage. Those who survived emerged into a world where old certainties had dissolved like sulphur in the stratosphere. The volcanic fingerprints endure in ice, but their true impact lingers in everything that came after. But historians still debate its full impact. Not everyone agrees on how bad 536 really was. Some historians call it the worst year to be alive, while others argue we've over-dramatized its impact. The truth lands somewhere in the middle, devastating for many, but inconsistent in its wreckage. Contradictions appear everywhere you look. Take tree rings from Scandinavia. They show near total growth stoppage around 536, yet Norse sagas barely mention catastrophe. Either skalds ignored the suffering, or coastal fishing communities found ways to adapt. Meanwhile, Byzantine records describe Constantinople's streets filled with corpses, but tax ledgers show grain shipments resuming within 5 years in some provinces. The variation comes down to geography and existing infrastructure. Regions with strong trade networks before the disaster recovered faster. Egypt, for instance, suffered famine but bounced back quickly, thanks to the Nile's predictable floods. In contrast, inland areas like the Balkans collapsed completely, their Roman roads now useless without imperial maintenance crews. Some scholars point to surprising resilience. A few Italian monasteries kept meticulous records throughout the crisis, showing stable book production even as the world outside crumbled. Archaeologists excavating a Burgundian village found evidence of careful rationing and communal grain stores that saved most residents. Not every community descended into chaos. Others highlight cultural differences in survival strategies. Chinese records focus on government relief efforts, soup kitchens, forced migrations to fertile regions, while European accounts emphasize prayer and penitence. The plague hit both regions, but responses varied wildly. Some Chinese provinces recovered harvests within a decade through aggressive crop rotation, whereas parts of Gaul reverted to subsistence foraging for generations. The arguments extend to death toll estimates. Initial studies suggested population drops over 50% in Europe, but newer archaeological surveys complicate that picture. Some British sites show continuous occupation through the worst years, just with smaller dwellings and fewer luxury goods. Either people found ways to endure, or deaths weren't as universal as we imagined. Economic impacts stir more debate. Certain trade goods like Egyptian papyrus disappeared from Europe for centuries, yet amber routes from the Baltic remained open. A few enterprising merchants apparently thrived despite, or because of, the collapse. Shipwrecks from this period still yield cargoes of desperate luxuries, bags of pepper alongside crudely minted coins. The plague's role gets questioned too. Genetic evidence confirms its presence, but some historians argue it accelerated rather than caused decline. Malnutrition had already weakened populations. The bacterium just finished what famine started. Outbreaks also varied regionally. Some areas report mass graves, while others show no plague evidence at all. Political interpretations differ most sharply. Traditional narratives say the crisis doomed the Roman Empire, yet Constantinople held on for nearly another millennium. Maybe the disasters changed the empire rather than destroyed it. Provincial governors became warlords not because of crop failures, but because central authority had always been weak. Archaeological dating adds complications. Many abandoned villages might have just shifted location slightly. What looks like collapse could be adaptation. Post holes don't reveal why people moved, only that they did. Some settlements reappear a few miles away with similar pottery styles, suggesting gradual relocation rather than catastrophe. Even the volcanic evidence faces scrutiny. Ice cores clearly show eruptions, but linking them directly to societal collapse ignores other factors. The late Roman Empire already suffered economic strain, barbarian pressures, and administrative bloat. Maybe the disasters simply revealed existing cracks rather than creating new ones. Regional exceptions undermine doomsday narratives. Parts of Ireland show unusual construction projects continuing through the worst years. Someone had surplus labour to build during famine. A Serbian fort excavated in 2018 contained well-stocked granaries dated to 540, contradicting nearby sites where people ate bark. Recovery rates vary just as much. Some areas regained pre-disaster population levels within 2 generations, while others took centuries. The differences likely depended on local leadership, whether rulers hoarded resources or distributed them. Peasant revolts in Gaul suggest some knew their lords could have helped more. Climate science adds nuance. Tree rings indicate the 540s were cold globally, but not universally disastrous. Certain highland regions actually benefited from slightly longer growing seasons. A few alpine villages expanded their farmland during this period, taking advantage of receding glaciers. The biological record contradicts itself too. Some mass graves show victims dying well nourished, perhaps from plague rather than starvation. Other skeletons display signs of prolonged hunger without trauma, suggesting peaceful if desperate communities. Uniform suffering makes for better stories than messy reality. Textual evidence carries its own biases. Monastic chroniclers emphasize signs and omens, while secular records focused on taxes and land. Byzantine historians wrote for elite audiences who wanted morality tales, not accurate death counts. Even objective-seeming data like coin hoards might reflect panic rather than actual wealth loss. Modern comparisons complicate things further. We imagine 536 through lenses of later disasters, the Black Death, nuclear winter scenarios, but 6th century people lacked our frames of reference. What seems apocalyptic to us might have felt like another hardship in an already difficult era. Their normal was simply different. The debate continues partly because evidence keeps changing. Each new ice core sample or palynology study adjusts the picture slightly. A 2022 pollen analysis showed surprising forest regeneration in Britain during supposed famine years. Were people dying off, or just switching subsistence strategies? Historians also bring their own biases. Those studying collapse see catastrophe everywhere. Resilient scholars find adaptation in the same data. Both perspectives contain truth. Maybe 536 wasn't the worst year to be alive, but rather the worst year in living memory for specific places. Consensus exists on some points. The volcanic eruptions happened, temperatures dropped, crops failed in many regions, people suffered. But beyond these basics, interpretations diverge wildly. The disasters definitely changed history, just not uniformly or predictably. One thing remains undeniable. The period left marks that lasted centuries. Whether through population loss, cultural trauma, or political restructuring, the events around 536 shaped the medieval world that followed. The scale varies by location, but the direction doesn't. The divergent impacts actually make the period more instructive. Pure catastrophe teaches little besides, don't get hit by volcanoes. But uneven devastation shows how societies fail, or don't, under stress. Some communities had systems that worked, others collapsed instantly. The difference might hold answers for modern crises. So why does it matter today? Not as a cautionary tale about volcanoes, but as a stress test for civilizations. The disasters exposed which social structures could bend without breaking, and which shattered at the first hard winter. We're left studying the broken pieces and the survivors, trying to learn what kept some fires burning when others went dark. Climate change isn't the first global crisis humanity has faced, but it might be the first we see coming. The disasters of 536 AD reveal how fragile societies are when nature flips the script. A volcanic winter that no one predicted or understood brought empires to their knees. Today we've swapped ignorance for overconfidence. We know the threats, but assume technology will save us. The past suggests otherwise. Modern civilization shares uncomfortable similarities with 6th century Rome. We too rely on fragile supply chains and just-in-time deliveries. The average supermarket stocks 3 days' worth of food. Cities depend on electricity for everything from sewage pumps to refrigeration. Remove one key component, whether sunlight or silicon chips, and systems start failing fast. The difference is scale. Where Rome's collapse took decades, ours could accelerate in weeks. Volcanic threats haven't disappeared. Iceland's Katla volcano erupts every 50 years on average. It's overdue. Indonesia's Lake Toba could produce another super eruption, like the one that nearly wiped out humanity 75,000 years ago. Geological records show VEE 7 eruptions like 536's occur roughly every 600 years. The last was Tambora in 1815, meaning we're statistically due for another. Monitoring systems would give us warning now, but warning doesn't equal preparedness. Climate science has identified disturbing feedback loops. Major eruptions today could interact unpredictably with global warming. Some models suggest ash plumes might linger longer in a warmer atmosphere. Others warn melting glaciers could increase volcanic activity by relieving pressure on magma chambers. The 536 event was bad during a stable climate. Imagine it happening amid today's weather extremes. Food security remains our weakest point. Globalized agriculture means most countries rely on imports for staple crops. A year without summer would devastate multiple breadbaskets simultaneously. Stockpiles might last months, not years. Urban populations with no farming skills would fare worst, unlike 6th century peasants who at least knew how to forage. Modern emergency plans rarely account for multi-year disasters. Medical infrastructure would crumble under dual pressures. The 536 plague spread through malnourished populations with no antibiotics. Today's hospitals run on thin margins. Power outages alone could collapse care systems. Pandemic responses improved after COVID, but not enough for concurrent food and disease crises. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria make the equation worse. We might face plagues as untreatable as the Justinian strain. Economic systems aren't stress-tested for collapse. Digital currencies and stock markets assume continuous connectivity. Supply chains lack redundancy after decades of efficiency optimization. In 536, gold coins gave way to grain bartering. Would Bitcoin or credit cards survive a similar shock? The financial markers we take for granted could evaporate faster than Roman denarii did. Social stability may be our biggest vulnerability. 6th century people at least shared cultural frameworks for suffering. Many saw disasters as divine tests. Modern societies fractured by inequality and misinformation might spiral faster into chaos. Studies show people cooperate well in short crises but turn hostile during prolonged hardship. The darker months dragged on. The faster Roman law gave way to mob rule. Yet we do have advantages. Scientific understanding lets us model disasters before they hit. Early warning systems could buy time to safeguard crops or distribute stockpiles. Communication networks might prevent the isolation that doomed 6th century villages. Genetic research could develop plague-resistant variants of staple crops. The key is using these tools before catastrophe strikes, not scrambling to deploy them amid chaos. Global cooperation makes the difference between survival and collapse. After the 536 eruption, fragmented societies faced the crisis alone. Today's connected world could theoretically coordinate relief if politics don't intervene. Vaccine nationalism during COVID showed how quickly solidarity breaks down. A food crisis would likely trigger export bans and hoarding, just as Byzantine governors confiscated grain. Preparation gaps reveal dangerous blind spots. Governments plan for temporary disruptions, not systemic collapse. The US Strategic National Stockpile contains medical supplies for months, not years. Seed banks like Norway's Svalbard Vault preserve crop diversity but won't feed billions. Most disaster drills assume a return to normal within weeks. Nobody practices running cities on 10% of normal resources for a decade. Infrastructure decisions worsen our fragility. Concentrated megacities resemble Constantinople before the plague. Dense populations dependent on distant supply lines. Rural areas with local food sources fared better in the 6th century. Today's suburban sprawl offers neither urban efficiency nor rural self-sufficiency, leaving millions stranded when systems fail. Some communities are relearning resilience. The permaculture movement revives ancient techniques for sustainable farming. Prepper subcultures stockpile skills as well as supplies. Canning, basic medicine, off-grid power. These niches might preserve knowledge the way monasteries saved classical texts. The question is whether they can scale up in time. Technological solutions bring new vulnerabilities. Vertical farming could theoretically feed cities without sunlight if the power stays on. Lab-grown meat needs stable infrastructure. 6th century peasants couldn't imagine. Relying on complex systems to fix complex problems creates a house of cards. Sometimes survival means keeping solutions simple. The psychological toll gets overlooked. 6th century writers described widespread dissociation and despair during the disaster. Modern mental health systems already struggle with routine caseloads. A prolonged crisis could leave millions traumatized even if physically alive. Societies don't just need stockpiles. They need coping mechanisms for collective grief. Historical revisionism haunts recovery efforts. After 536, some regions reinvented their histories to make sense of suffering. Today's misinformation landscape could distort disasters in real time. If social media turned COVID mitigation into culture wars, imagine how it would handle bread riots or plague containment. Truth becomes the first casualty in prolonged emergencies. Ironically, our best hope lies in remembering 536's lessons. The societies that survived did so through adaptability, not stubbornness. They abandoned unworkable systems, migrated when necessary, and reinvented traditions. Those who clung to status quo thinking died with it. The past doesn't offer blueprints but does provide stress tests, showing which strategies endure when the unimaginable happens. We can't prevent the next mega disaster. Ice cores and tree rings prove these events recur throughout history. But we can choose whether to be Constantinople in 540, paralysed by declining grandeur, or a backwater village that quietly adapts and survives. The difference comes down to clear-eyed preparation and psychological flexibility. But let's end on a lighter note. 536 AD proves how quickly nature can erase progress. One volcanic winter rewrote societies that took centuries to build. The past reminds us our stability is thin. Good harvests and mild winters are gifts, not guarantees. For all our technology and knowledge, we're still vulnerable to forces beyond control. Climate change may be slow-moving compared to 536's catastrophe, but the principle remains. Civilization thrives on predictable conditions. When they vanish, so does everything built upon them. If you found this unsettling journey through history valuable, consider subscribing. Let me know which forgotten era we should explore next. Now go enjoy your next meal, and maybe plant something, just in case.